Welcome to the Ending Sexploitation podcast, where we decode sexual harm and provide you with active solutions. I'm your host, Kaylee McNamara. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode, and thank you so much for tuning in. Today, our episode will be a little bit different than usual. We'll actually be listening in on a presentation from our 2024 Coalition to End Sexual Exploitation Summit. The presentation we're going to listen to is from Reem Alsalem, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women and Girls. She took on that role with a mission to shed light on the root causes and consequences of violence against women and girls worldwide, and she's an incredible expert on gender issues, refugee and migrant rights, transitional justice, and humanitarian responses. And over the years, she's worked across a wide range of UN bodies, including the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, where she served in 13 different countries, leading programs to support and protect survivors of gender-based violence. In this session, Reem is going to focus on prostitution as a form of sexual exploitation and a violation of human rights. This issue of prostitution is one that we haven't spoken about much recently on the podcast, but it's a really important topic and one that we will increasingly dive into. You know, prostitution, according to the National Center on Sexual Exploitation, our stance is that it is a form of sexual exploitation, and it's commonly defined as the exchange of sexual conduct for money or other things of value like food or shelter. Those profiting from prostitution presented as harmless, but the reality for people involved is actually much darker. And as we'll talk about in future episodes, you know, coercion, force, fraud, and social injustices are necessary to make prostitution possible. But again, we're going to continue to unpack a lot of those nuances and even commonly debated issues around these topics. But for today, I think that Reem Alsalem's presentation will be informative and a powerful place to start.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's really a privilege for me to be here. I want to thank COSI for the kind invitation to be with you and to also engage with all of you working on this important issue. As was said, I'm the Special Rapporteur on Ending Violence Against Women and Girls. Very briefly, this means I'm an independent expert that has been appointed by the UN Human Rights Council. This is sort of the kitchen of the United Nations for developing the human rights policies on all sorts of issues. So we act in an independent capacity. We do our work impartially and independently. And as part of the work I do, and I'm mandated to do, the Council asks me to prepare two thematic reports. One I present to the Human Rights Council, and the other one I present to the General Assembly. I can do them on any issue I would like, and I have deliberately chosen to do this year's report to the Human Rights Council on the issue of prostitution, because I know that so far there had not been any comprehensive human rights-centered analysis of prostitution, of models, of policies on prostitution. And I felt really that this was the issue that was missing so far globally. So while that had not been done, and as was alluded to also by Dawn, at the same time, there are many sort of very strong positions being put forward that are having an impact, are shaping policies, and not always with the best consequences. And so through this report, I have tried basically to unpack the consequences of prostitution, but also to bust a few myths that dominate the debate when it comes to prostitution. So I would like to take you through these right now. So myth number one, prostitution is actually sex work. And it is just work, like any other. In fact, that couldn't be further from the truth. Prostitution is a system of egregious violence and exploitation of women and girls. It's a system because it involves broadly three different actors. You have the prostituted women and children. I focus on girls. You have the buyer of sexual acts, and you have those that profiteer from the prostitution, That can be individuals, can be businesses, can be states. It's the pimps, basically. And prostitution violates all the fundamental human rights that these women and girls should be enjoying, whether it's their human right to safety, whether it's to dignity or equality. And in fact, what women and girls experience in prostitution is a violation of these fundamental rights. They are raped, gang raped, kidnapped, abducted, forcefully disappeared, killed, urinated on, ejaculated on, rendered disabled, beaten, enslaved, trafficked, threatened with death, forced into unprotected sex, imprisoned. They undergo coerced sterilization and abortion. These are just a few examples of what women and girls in prostitution have to endure. Prostitution inflicts multiple forms of violence, whether it's physical, psychological, or economic, and has a lasting impact on those that are prostituted, but also their families. The impact really stays over generations. In terms of psychological impact, they undergo memory loss, they can be severely depressed, they suffer from insomnia, eating disorders, substance abuse, and suicidality. It's often said that doing prostitution work means that you can get some money, but in fact, it's economically disastrous, including for the women in prostitution, because many of them are kept in bondage even before they would have arrived at a prostitution site. They are robbed, often by the pimps or the clients, and they have to pay interests to the pimp or to the state, depending on whether it is legalized or not. Prostitution also does not meet the international standards of decent work. The International Labour Organization defines that as productive work for women and men in conditions of freedom, equity, security, and human dignity. And as I've just described, all these criteria and all these standards are missing. Myth number 2, women choose to do sex work. Prostitution is the result of a system of patriarchy, male demand and entitlement, and inequality. It's fueled by wars, by globalization, where everything can be bought and sold, and structural discrimination. In prostitution, almost exclusively, women constitute the supply, and almost exclusively, men constitute the demanders. And that is a very sexist vision, very harmful but deeply sexist vision of society and relations between men and women. The women and girls that are supplied in prostitution are amongst the most marginalized, excluded, and they are the ones really that become trapped in prostitution. They come from disimpoverished backgrounds, countries that might suffer from conflict or wars. They might suffer already from structural discrimination, either because of their race or religion or other grounds. And prostitution, therefore, sexualizes and racializes this poverty. And what I have found is that there is a racist fetishization and stereotyping also of women in prostitution. So it's in fact no coincidence that most women in prostitution are migrant women without status, are women in poverty, are women that have been, or children that have been abused while they are children, and they have no legal regular status. So in the US, for example, the majority are Latinas, indigenous, Black women. Those are the ones that are overrepresented in prostitution in the US. Myth number 3, being called a sex worker is empowering. I think yesterday one of the speakers talked about the importance of terminology, that really what we call something really matters. And I think this is particularly the case here. There are those who would say that being called a sex worker is empowering, that it serves to destigmatize, that it shows that it's their own choice and their own agency. But if you talk to survivors of prostitution, they will tell you that using the term sex worker gaslights them and gaslights their experience, that it doesn't reflect the immense exploitation and abuse that they have suffered. And it does not also reflect the criminal responsibility of the perpetrator, nor their status as victims of immense violence. Using the term sex worker normalizes that violence. And as victims and survivors of violence, actually the term victim is a legal term in international law. It means that you've survived immense violence, human rights violence, but also it means that you have a right to reparation, assistance, and protection, including by the state. And that you do not lose neither agency nor dignity nor the right to participation and representation if you are identified as a victim or a survivor. On the contrary, you should be fully involved in designing and implementing solutions and also policies that have a direct impact on you. And I should say from the UN perspective also, using the term sex worker does not reflect agreed on terminology by state. The myth number 4 is that full decriminalization of prostitution eliminates harm of being in prostitution. So those that come with this argument would say that if it becomes a job like any other, women will be in less danger because they don't have to hide the fact that they're engaging in prostitution. And the fact that a buyer of sexual act does not have to hide that he is a so-called client makes it also safer. It means that they will have access to regular jobs, and it means that they will be better integrated in society, and it means that they're going to have more access to health services, and that they will have access to HIV treatment and pension schemes, etc., etc. But actually, in fact, when you look at the countries that have fully legalized or decriminalized all aspects of prostitution, and by that I mean not just decriminalized the victim, so decriminalized the woman exercising prostitution, but also the buying of sexual acts and the pimping, when you look at the data and you look at actually the results of these policies in the countries where they are, you see a very, very different story. First of all, in Germany, for example, out of the 25,000 women in prostitution that are known to the government, though the actual number is estimated to be in the hundreds of thousands, only a little bit over than 50 have a regular, let's say, job contract in prostitution. They actually do not benefit at all from an increased security and safety, because as we know, once the door closes on you and the buyer of sexual act, you're pretty much on your own. And the expectations are very much the same. And in fact, because it becomes very normalized to be paying for sexual acts, the client, so to speak, or the buyer of sexual acts expects to get their money's worth. You see that women in prostitution continue to die at very high rates, continue to be killed. Trafficking of pimps continues to be very low. In fact, it becomes very difficult for law enforcement to do its job, to investigate and to go after pimps, because it becomes really diluted in the world of work. It also makes it much harder for women to get justice if they are treated with violence or abuse, because suddenly the issue becomes a work accident rather than a serious fundamental human rights violation that you have experienced. So, in fact, all these pretended objectives are not what eventually happens on the ground. Myth number 5 is that pornography is different and safer than prostitution. In fact, as I say in my report, porn is filmed prostitution. So it's a variation of prostitution. And it happens mostly without the consent of the victim. In fact, 90%, almost 90% of the content of pornography is incredibly violent and incredibly degrading. 99% of those targeted by deepfakes are also women and girls. So it's incredibly gendered as well. It really serves to attack, degrade, and humiliate women. And in fact, also pornography is a business and therefore has a business model. And part of that business model is for it to become more violent and to become more, let's say, new, offer new scenarios and new material in order to keep the consumer interested, coming for more. But in having the consumer coming for more novel and violent content, it means also that it becomes more difficult for the consumer to become satisfied and to achieve arousal. So you have addicts, therefore, to pornography that keep coming for more only to be satisfied less. It also shapes the sexual expectations of entire generations of men and boys who will then try to play out in real life what they see in pornography. So it erases very quickly the lines between sex and sexual violence. And therefore, the increased use of pornography leads to more aggression. It leads to a more sense of entitlement and actually drives men and boys more and more to seek physical prostitution, to women and girls in prostitution. And as I said, by enacting the violence they see online in real life, it's women and girls that suffer. So it's no coincidence that we see and hear of more acts of strangulation. It's no coincidence, therefore, that we see the perpetrators of sexual violence becoming younger and younger, including of gang rape. And adolescent girls, not to mention women, are very distressed and feel very violated by this increased pornification and sexualization. And what it teaches, actually, is that the only way to feel valued as a girl or as a woman is to feel sexually desired, a very perverse way of being sexually desired. Myth number 6, prostituted women want full decriminalization. Again, that cannot be further from the truth. If you talk to survivors of prostitution, they will tell you that prostitution is a system of violence. They will tell you that if they had a way out, a dignified, durable way out, they would not have been doing what they are doing. They would tell you that they can not really say that because they are often excluded from policy-making platforms. They are not consulted, they are not listened to enough when policies are being made. And in fact, even frontline organizations and actors that work with them are often hounded out of policy places. They are underfunded and they are also disinvited. On the other hand, those that advocate for full decriminalization or legalization of prostitution are often invited to the table, can often engage in policy discussions and influence policies. What prostituted women will tell you is that they want more to be done in order for them to be able to get out of prostitution. They want themselves to be decriminalized, in the sense not to have a criminal record. They want to be able not to worry about being immediately deported if they step out of prostitution. They want access to trauma care, health care. They want support in finding income in other ways. They want support with housing. They don't want to lose their families. They want support with substance addiction. They want to find another dignified life. And they want the states and others to listen to them and to help them. And in fact, all these aspects that I've mentioned do exist and are present in a model called the Nordic model or the equality model, which is implemented in a number of countries in the Nordic countries, but also in others like France, for example, and in theory also in Canada. The last myth that I would like to talk about is that decriminalizing, legalizing prostitution is the only thing that works. So as I said, there are those that will tell you that legalizing prostitution is a way to achieve equality, is a way to achieve the safety, dignity of those in prostitution, but also entire societies. And as I said, the problem with legalizing prostitution is that it doesn't address the demand issue. When you legalize prostitution, you're saying that buying sexual acts is okay. In fact, there is nothing wrong with it. And demand for sexual acts is what drives prostitution, makes it prosper. And around prostitution, then a lot of other criminal activities and networks flourish. And with it also pimps and traffickers and other illegal activities. And therefore, by not addressing demand, we are contributing to societies where we don't have equality between men and women, and where, in fact, the entire society suffer, whether it's the victims, whether it's the buyers of sexual acts, and others. And the Nordic model, in addition to offering ways out for women in prostitution, it also addresses the demand issue. How? By actually criminalizing demand. So in France, for example, you might be fined, or you will be fined, at least fined, if you are found to buy sexual acts. And it also might mean prison sentences, also for traffickers. So the Nordic model really has proven its benefits, and I would very much encourage countries to look at it as a model that can be followed. So I will stop here, and thank you very much.
Thank you all so much for listening today, and we will put a link to resources to learn more in the show notes. Please remember to rate, subscribe, share this podcast, and thank you all for joining us in Ending Sexploitation.